Cadillac is coming to Formula One with a brand new General Motors backed team joining the grid in 2026. An agreement in principle between GM, Cadillac and F1 will, barring any unexpected setback, end in a new 11th team after all. That is despite every application for a new entry previously being rejected. And you might be asking such questions as, wait, wasn't Cadillac one of those rejected teams? And where is Andretti in all of this? And you'd be completely right to ask those questions because Andretti Cadillac was indeed involved from the beginning, and this is still kind of Andretti Cadillac, even though it doesn't have that exact name. It sounds confusing and there is a lot to unpack, so let's get into the key things you need to know about this big news. This team's going to bear the Cadillac image. General Motors has tentatively referred to it as Cadillac Formula One, which is the first real hint we have of its identity. But what does that actually mean, and how much has it evolved from what we saw before? The original proposal was as Andretti Cadillac, and the idea was that it was effectively going to be an Andretti Formula One team with some Cadillac stickers on it and a customer Renault engine to begin with. That morphed slightly into a plan to eventually have a works GM Cadillac engine in the future, and that kind of works team identity is what the new version of this proposal really leans into. The full Cadillac image and the General Motors name or branding in some capacity is a big deal, and we've had the first glimpse of what it might look like, even though it's not the most impressive render that we've ever seen a team put out. And actually I think the edit that we have come up with might be slightly better, but let us know in the comments which one you prefer. The point is that this is, while it's going to be a customer team to start with, and we'll have more on that later in this video, and then a works team hopefully by the end of the decade, certainly 28, 29 is the target. This is much more proper. It's a General Motors team from the very start, GM involved as a team owner along with the Cadillac branding, rather than slapping its name on a team run by something else. Of course, it still leans into the familiar model of having a specialist organisation running a works entry, but that is one very common in other motorsport, but even in Formula One. Mercedes operates in a very similar way, as Mercedes itself only owns 1/3 of Team Brackley and Brixworth, the engine operation, if you want to call it that. In this case, the specialist unit is TWG Global, running under the Cadillac banner, with GM having a big stake in the whole thing and eventually greenlighting an engine. And Cadillac actually has experience of this because its top-level sports car campaign is run in a similar way. Cadillac works with Dallara as a development partner and has Chip Ganassi Racing running its cars. So we're going to see the Formula One version of that between Cadillac, TWG and GM. We've mentioned a lot of names so far, and there were a lot of names, individuals and entities mentioned in Formula One's announcement and GM and Cadillac's own statements. But a name that we've barely seen mentioned, and definitely wasn't mentioned by F1, is Andretti. This is no longer a project with Andretti in the main name as it was at the start. In fact, Andretti Global might remain a cornerstone of the project, but again, not in name, and it's now headed by investor Dan Tauris rather than Michael Andretti himself. There was no reference to Michael or his company, just a mention of Tauris as CEO of TWG Global's motorsport business. Now that is Andretti Global, because it's owned and operated by TWG, which also includes Mark Walter as an investor. This is effectively a new look for what started life as Andretti Global and what Andretti Global has built itself into between its massive new US facility and a satellite base in the UK. But it signals a fresh start for the whole enterprise, removing not just Michael Andretti from leadership, but also the Andretti name as an operator or an entrant. So what was formerly publicly known as Andretti Global has actually achieved a lot until now. It's invested heavily, really heavily, into this program. It has the two bases so far. It's funded extensive aerodynamic and chassis development work. It's recruited more than 200 people for the team alone. That actually got indirectly mentioned by F1 when it referred to milestones that had been achieved so far by this entrant in its preparations during the course of 2024. But again, Andretti Global doesn't actually get a shout out. So what we now know as TWG, being fronted by Tauris and including people like Walter, will now have the biggest part to play in supporting Cadillac and GM. That's going to include having to cough up at least a portion of whatever anti-dilution fund needs to be paid to secure this entry. We know that that's going to be more than the $200 million it is currently set at, because Andretti, or what was formerly Andretti, is going to be joining in 2026, which is after the current Concord agreement expires, and the new Concord will have a much increased anti-dilution fund. That's been rumoured to be as high as $600 million, but Cadillac, GM and TWG won't have to pay that much. In fact, the BBC's reported that it'll be paying around $450 million. Michael Andretti was key to all this starting, but he's not around anymore, at least not frontline, and he's definitely not running the show. In fact, the only nod to his original vision for this is that his father Mario, the 1978 Formula 1 world champion, will have an ambassadorial role and be a director. But as for Michael himself, he couldn't be a frontline part of this project. He's been confrontational, controversial, caused tension, rubbed people up the wrong way, and whether or not you agree with that characterisation or think it's fair, that is how F1's seen him. In short, Michael was key to getting this project as far as he did, but he wasn't the person to take it any further. That's why Andretti Global changed hands with Taurus taking over, and why there needs to be changes in the identity like TWG Global, just to put a little bit of distance between a man who was problematic in trying to get this entry successful in the first place. You might think avoiding any possible mention of Michael Andretti or his eponymous company is a little bit petty and comes across as a personal vendetta, and finally letting his team get into Formula 1 when you've removed any mention of him and it's no longer his team does kind of support that on the surface. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and whether he likes it or not, Michael Andretti's had to accept that he cannot run the show and isn't getting an F1 team in his name. The long-term plan is for this team to be a full works entry, and that means a GM Cadillac engine further down the road. That was originally slated for 2028, although now it's only being talked to us by the end of the decade. So what's it going to do in the meantime? It's going to have to be a customer, obviously, and at the moment the expectation is that will be Ferrari. Talks do seem to be progressing well, but there's no deal done yet. Ferrari is a very logical choice. It has a lot of experience supplying Formula 1 teams, and in fact, it's supplied and continues to supply the most recent new team that joined the grid, Haas, from 2016. It will also have extra capacity come 2026 because one of its current customers, Sauber, is striking out on its own as the Audi works team and will therefore have its own engine. It would also not be a surprise to see Cadillac do a deal with Ferrari that involves more than just the engine and includes a gearbox supply and the rear suspension as well. Given the short lead time between now and 2026, that would give Cadillac less work to do in crucial areas. Ferrari is well used to supplying these parts as well as the engine, so it can be counted on to produce quality, reliable products. It's also the kind of organisation that can do this on an initial 2-year deal, but if the GM Caddy engine takes a little bit longer to come to fruition, Ferrari could be in a position to extend quite easily. If a Ferrari deal isn't possible, then Cadillac actually has a guaranteed backup. That is Honda. This is because the FIA regulations guarantee any team an engine supply. It's basically allowed to force the engine supplier that currently supplies the fewest teams and isn't a new manufacturer into supplying the other team. In this case, that would be Honda. This project is clearly well advanced, and for the first time, F1's publicly saying it's actually impressed by what's been achieved so far. But it still needs to get a lot bigger. If there is a 200 plus workforce at the moment in what's going to be the F1 team, then it needs to get 3 or 4 times bigger before it's even matching the smallest teams on the grid at the moment. There is, unsurprisingly, a big recruitment drive in place, and actually loads of jobs went up on LinkedIn recently, which passed a lot of people by and was actually a precursor to the news that we're discussing right now. And development is where it gets interesting because it's been spending a lot of time in Toyota's wind tunnel in Germany, performing a lot of chassis development and apparently even passing some initial crash tests. And very, very intriguingly, has unlimited aero and CFD time because it's not bound by any of the existing regulations. This is a team that still doesn't officially have an entry, so it's not bound by what currently limits all the other 10 teams. And that includes doing 2026 aero testing, which the other teams aren't allowed to do until January the 1st, 2025. So while this team does have a disadvantage in terms of experience and size, it has a head start in a key area. The question is how long it's going to be allowed to keep doing unlimited development work for once it has signed up and does have an entry. Is it going to have to start adhering to wind tunnel and CFD limits sooner, or is it going to be able to push on until the 1st of January next year? We don't know, but the quality of the work it's done so far and how long it's able to have free reign could be quite important in how competitive this team is in 2026. But it's important to remember that 2026 is just the starting point. While GM and Cadillac will want to be as competitive as possible from their very first race, realistically, this has to be a long-term project. And there's a glide path for when it will have works team status by the end of the decade, which is when it will have to start getting serious. One of the main things we've seen since news of Cadillac's potential F1 entry broke during the Las Vegas Grand Prix weekend is that this is all just a result of the Department of Justice's investigation into F1 and its initial rejection of Andretti and General Motors. It would be naive not to think it's a massive benefit to not have that pressure anymore and that scrutiny and have a big problem being dragged out. But it would also be wrong and blind to the facts to pretend that that is the only motivation. If it was, then the team would be being let in after all in its initial guise as Andretti Cadillac and on the terms that were proposed at the very start of the year, and that is not what's happening. It's also worth remembering that F1 always said it would look at the application differently in 2028 when this was ready to be a GM works team, because GM is the part that F1 was always interested in. The bottom line is that while it might seem subtle, there are significant differences to this application. It's no longer a Cadillac badged Andretti team with a customer Renault engine. It's a more full-on GM entry from the very beginning, with GM having an ownership or controlling stake. That amounts to what F1 views as a real GM team with a proper engine plan, more commitment from better partners, and ultimately, without Michael Andretti involved, more convincing leadership. What might happen in terms of drivers is where this starts to get a little bit more speculative. Previously, Colton Herta was favourite for a drive if Andretti ever got on the grid. He was a favoured son of Michael Andretti, but Andretti's successor Tauris likes Herta as well. So he has to be considered a contender, assuming he can finally get a super licence, because even though he had a very strong IndyCar season in 2024, because that championship is for some reason chronically underrated by the FIA super licence system, he still doesn't have enough points. That could change in 2025 if Herta gets a few FP1 outings and completes enough mileage to get some bonus super licence points, and of course if he has another good season in IndyCar and finishes high up in the championship again. This is obviously assuming that the team still wants to go down the American driver route. It was certainly Michael Andretti's preference to have an all-American or certainly American-strong driver lineup. 2 Americans in the car might be a bit unrealistic, but if not Herta, then the other contenders are a bit tricky to determine. Of course, Logan Sargent was in F1 for just over a season and a half with Williams, but wasn't quick enough and crashed a lot. There is Jack Crawford, who is doing a good job in Formula 2, is a current Aston Martin junior driver, and is already linked to Andretti as he's a reserve and development driver for them in Formula E. Outside of that specific preference though, it wouldn't be a surprise to see this team go down the route of picking at least one experienced driver. And for 2026, there are some potentially very interesting free agents like Valtteri Bottas or Yuki Tsunoda. The F1 grid growing to 22 cars again is a nice sign, but remember it wasn't that long ago that we actually had even more on the grid, so could it get even bigger still? There is capacity in the regulations and in F1's commercial agreement to have more than 11 teams. And F1 always wants to leave room for more, just in case an interesting manufacturer emerges and another potential works team is in the offing. For example, Toyota, which is now a Haas technical partner, might decide it wants a little bit more and expand into team ownership again in the future. But even if there was a viable 12th candidate, it would have to tick a lot of boxes and would likely face a lot of opposition. So for now, we should probably just be grateful that this 11th team is finally getting in.